This microwave tower was commissioned in 1970 as part of the East-West microwave link for the PMG. It saw service for more than 25 years, but now it remains abandoned for longer than it was in service. In this video, we will visit a small part of the original communications route for the East-West Telegraph line. A few March flies out at Israelite Bay, so much so that the dog won't come outside. This is all that remains of the Israelite Bay Telegraph Station. This building was constructed in 1896 to replace the original wooden building which was erected in 1875. I couldn't find any photos of this building in its original condition.
We've just left Israelite Bay and we're heading off on the major part of our trip. We're trying to get through to Air Sandpatch, or the Airbird Observatory, and then north to Cockabiddy, which is some 400 kilometres away. Road into Israelite Bay was really corrugated, and we're just leaving Israelite Bay looking for a place called Wattle Camp, which is 55 k's away, and the corrugations aren't any better this side. Enough to jar your tits off. We're on the route of the original telegraph line that went from Bremer Bay through Esperance Bay, Israelite Bay, and then out to Air Sandpatch. And this is one of the original telegraph poles. It's made out of wood. The second section, which was put in much later on, had steel poles. And there's even a insulator bracket here, which looks like it's stuck in 3 holes up the top there on the piece of wood. It was a single line for the telegraph line with an earth return. We've come across this lake and we can see that behind me are 2 other telegraph poles, and this one, which makes the 3rd in a line. This one's still secured with bits of wire to the ground and a post to secure it to so it doesn't fall over. And it still feels pretty sturdy. Wish I could take it home. I can't. I'm sad. And we're in this lake bed, and we're not far from the ocean, probably about 10 k's or so, if that, and it's full of cockle shells.
We have all heard and seen this various videos of the teletrack, a term I really hate, that is in the Cape York area. The track is a reference to the track that was used by the PMG to maintain the phone line, but there are many others in Australia at least as important. For us in WA, the most important are those lines that head east. These telegraph lines predate the PMG, Postmaster General, because there was no nation of Australia. They were built before Federation and funded by the states. I have worked in the communication industry for more than 40 years, and I have seen technology change many generations in that time. But in terms of electrical communications, the old telegraph line is arguably generation 1, followed closely by the telephone. Surprisingly, the first telegraph line in WA was pushed by private industry with only part funding coming from the government. This was the line from Perth to Fremantle and opened on the 21st of June 1869. The East-West line was funded by both the South Australian and West Australian governments, and each had some very difficult terrain to cross, especially since it was started in 1875. The line was to run from Albany, which had been connected to Perth in 1870, to Port Augusta in South Australia. The Albany to Eucla section was built by the WA Post and Telegraph Department and supervised by Mr. R. Nucky. The section from Fowlers Bay to Eucla was begun in 1876, also under Mr. Nucky. This last section was finished on the 15th of July 1877. The line became operational on the 8th of December 1877 and spanned the distance of 1,986 miles.
Here we are in the middle of the telegraph line, and I'm standing next to a replacement pole and the wireless scarps on my left hand side, and we're heading to Point Culver, which is probably another 20 k's in front of us. And behind us you've got the scenery, and the poles would have extended all the way down this clear plain, about every 100 yards apart. We look at it these days and think it was pretty simple technology, but back in 1876 this is what linked the east coast to the west coast of Australia. And you've got to really admire the people who put this stuff in, because we worked out that they would have carted something in the order of 70,000 poles to put up every 100 yards. And back in those days it was very, very isolated country. It's hard enough these days, but back in 1876 it would have been almost impossible. Got to really take your hat off to the old blokes.
The WA section ran close to the coast from Eucla via Air Sandpatch, which is now the Air Bird Observatory, to Israelite Bay, then Esperance, then Bremer Bay to Albany. The route caused many problems with the electrical signal due to moisture from the ocean. To overcome this, a new route was built from Air Sandpatch to Baladonia, then to Norseman, where the line went both south to Esperance and north to Widgymortha and Coolgardie. This was commenced in 1896 and finished in 1897. This system also used duplex, where two signals could be transmitted at the same time, thus doubling the speed of transmission.
We're travelling along the telegraph track still. We've been on it for probably 3 or 4 days. A few miles back there we come across one of the linesman's camp, which was just a water tank and some other debris there. But we've come across this roll of old telephone wire, or telegraph wire. That's really interesting.
We didn't find any insulators that were unbroken, but the date on some of these went as far back as 1874, nearly 150 years ago. The telegraph line operated for 50 years, but with the completion of the Trans-Australian Railway line in 1927, with a more easily maintained telegraph line alongside, the original east-west route was finally closed.
There's more than one insulator here. You can see there's one here. That's a different top to that.
The telegraph track was once used as a route for travel from the east, especially during the gold rush day, because there was no air highway until World War II approached Australia's shores in 1942. The more modern 1896 telegraph route is now hard to find and pretty overgrown, as it appears to have less traffic.
Still going okay back there?
Yeah, we're going okay.
I don't know, do you reckon it's getting a bit worse through here than it was yesterday?
Might be, I don't know yet. Give it another few minutes, please.
Hopefully in about a kilometre or so we should hook up with the what I think is the continuation of the telegraph line, and it might be a bit better there.
All we can do is keep going anyway at this point.
We battled on through the scrub, taking a lot of care because we are by ourselves in the middle of nowhere and we need to make sure we don't break our vehicles. Then we stumble onto this old campsite, which I suspect is a linesman's camp. And then we see this old wooden pole with the wire still attached. How amazing is that? We pulled up near a metal pole, which were either made by Buller or Siemens. I fossicked amongst the broken insulator parts to see if I could find a date or other indication of their age. Some of these insulators have been shot at, and others have broken because the metal brackets have rusted and expanded, forcing the porcelain insulator to fracture.
This is why I want one, 1874.
That's the date on it.
Other than insulators, we also find the remains of food tins, showing us that people worked and lived out here well before we
More
arrived.
bits there that you can keep and collect and maybe glue it together a bit.
Yeah, they're not all the same insulator.
This track was quite difficult based on its isolation. We traversed many road conditions from sand, mud, gravel to sharp limestone rocks. Our rate of travel was very slow to limit the damage to tyres and to the vehicles.
For the last few days we've been following the original telegraph track, which was commissioned in 1876, that followed the coast from Israelite Bay to Air Bird Observatory. In 1896 they put another one up that came through Baladonia and cut through to the Air Bird Observatory, and we've just cut across that track now, and hopefully we'll follow it all the way to Air Bird. And this is the first telegraph pole that we've seen on this section of the track. Hopefully there should be one every 100 yards.
rear antenna is actually hitting the telegraph wire.
Yeah, I can see that. It's probably lucky there's no time zone through it.
We have now located ourselves on the second route of the telegraph track, and we have made this exciting discovery of a long section of original poles still in place, with the wire strung between them. This is perhaps the very wire that carried the messages to the eastern states about the new gold discoveries in the west at Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie, and thus beginning the influx of people to the western third of the continent. It is fairly overgrown through here now, but once the area was cleared to ensure no vegetation impacted that important wire.
Look at all those poles just go straight line all the way through.
You can see the white insulators in the trees, all the way up to that ridge right on the horizon.
Imagine living out here in those days though.
Would have been pretty cool, wouldn't it?
Well, I wouldn't mind it, but I think a lot of other people would. I think women would hate it.
Would have been pretty harsh back in 1896 too. We've still got the old telegraph line straight above us still.
Pretty cool, isn't it?
Sure is.
The rough track is behind us now as we descend the escarpment to the old Ayr Sandpatch Telegraph Station. Here are some fun facts. The Ayr Telegraph Station was left untouched after it was abandoned in 1927 and was not reused until the 1970s, when it was fixed up as the Gould Bird League of Australia Observatory. It has remained in their care since. Israelite Bay fell into ruin and vandalism. Balladonia has mostly been protected as it is on a station, and here is where you can win some money. Eucla as a town was swallowed up by the sand dunes, which move around and sometimes uncover a building that is always called the telegraph station. However, it is not the telegraph station. That was dismantled to build the original Amber Roadhouse. The building that is uncovered is either the telegraph or postmaster's house. £10 please. The track to the observatory is not terribly bad, but it is very sandy and not suitable for two-wheel drive vehicles. Caravans should also be left at the top of the escarpment. The old telegraph building is often maintained by volunteer workers and is a very original structure. Many artefacts have been collected and are now housed in a museum. This makes for fascinating viewing, especially for old comms techs like me. Our last mission for this trip is a brief visit to Burnaby, which was a farm that was run by one of the original telegraph workers over 100 years ago. I think he may have even run his own telegraph feed to the property, and the trip down this last section shows how wide the cleared area under the line was.
See how wide this has been cleared? It still stayed cleared.
Yeah, it's strange, isn't it?
The original buildings for the post and telegraph offices were usually simple affairs, like this one at Balladonia in 1897. This is the original telegraph station at Eucla, and this beautiful stone building is its replacement. Here on Stanley Street at Eucla in 1907, we can see the new building and its earlier version 2 doors down. The building in between is perhaps the one that is uncovered when the dunes move, and this panorama of Eucla in the 1890s, but after construction of the new building and before the dunes moved in, shows us what the town looked like. By 1933, only 6 years after the closure of the telegraph line, the dunes had begun their steady march across the town, covering all remnants of a once bustling community and covering forever those that were buried in the cemetery. And as we close, here is a tribute to those men who did all this work. The linesman and his camel, a camel team at Eucla preparing for another foray into the wilderness, and finally the telegraphists at work at the telegraph station. And with this we have one more fun fact. The desk has a South Australian side and a West Australian side. The theory is because there was a time zone difference between the states. This is actually not true. Euclid once had its own gazetted time zone 45 minutes earlier than Perth, the only quarter-hour zone in the world. The reason they had two sides to the desk was that each state had their own version of Morse code, so each state had to decode their own messages back to English and hand the sheet across the table for re-encoding into the other version of Morse for on-sending.